It's my purpose today to say a few words about the conspiratorial drive for one world government as it pertains to the African continent. For many decades prior to the middle of the 20th century, much of the African continent, especially black Africa, had benefited tremendously from European presence. The colonial influence of such nations as England, France, Belgium, and Portugal had brought Africa stable governments, hospitals, schools, and agricultural expertise. Missionaries had helped to bring civilized attitudes to warring tribes. The benevolent influences had already led to a growing native class of doctors, educators, and businessmen. The future looked increasingly bright for the dark continent, but progress was not what one-worlders in the West wanted. They wanted control. In one of history's most shameful abdications of responsibility, the European powers submitted to cries for independence and one man, one vote. Communist-inspired revolutionaries who were more easily characterized by the redness of their political views than the blackness of their skin perpetrated incredible atrocities on their own people and on others. It was for these revolutionaries that these nations were created, and each was immediately given international status by the United Nations and recognition by the West. France turned over Algeria to communist Ahmed Ben Bella in 1959. Algeria at the time was just as much a part of France, it was not a colony, as was Marseille or Paris. But it didn't matter to the political manipulators, though it certainly mattered in time to the people in Algeria. Belgium abandoned the Belgian Congo to communist Patrice Lumumba in 1960. Lumumba was so important to communists that a Patrice Lumumba University was created in the USSR, and it's still there today. When the mineral-rich province of Katanga in the Congo sought to secede from the chaos caused by Lumumba's government in 1961, the United Nations went to war against Katanga. Katanga's pro-Western, anti-communist black leader, Moise Tshombe, begged the United Nations to cease its bombing of hospitals and civilians in its attack on the productive element in Katanga. 46 doctors at the Elizabeth Bill Hospital in Katanga sent an anguished plea to the world's leaders, condemning the United Nations and begging to be left alone. If anyone needed to know what the UN really stood for, its military attack on Katanga supplied the story. The photos in this book show what the United Nations did in Katanga. By the mid-1960s, the communist and one world-inspired anti-colonialism campaign had reached its peak. Communists and pro-communist leaders emerged in nation after nation. Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, Sekou Touré in Guinea, Julius Nyerere in Tanzania, Kenneth Kaunda in Zambia. The chief characteristics of each of these emerging nations was one man, one vote, one time. Economic progress ceased, civilization was set back, and the only things that grew in each of these nations were government and debt. Portugal held out the longest, but by the middle of the 1970s, she was drained by years of guerrilla warfare in her overseas provinces. Again, not colonies, overseas provinces of Angola and Mozambique. Following the pattern of other black African, newly independent nations, Angola and Mozambique fell into the hands of pro-communist revolutionaries. The forces of international conspiracy then turned their attention to Rhodesia. Under the leadership of Ian Smith, Rhodesia had declared her complete independence from England in 1965. Here was a nation where prosperity was the norm. For the blacks, there was more education, better health care, a higher standard of living, and a brighter future than anywhere else on the continent. But the mania for black majority rule took over, and several communist-supplied revolutionary groups began their campaigns of savagery, mostly against blacks, but also against whites, to create the chaos and anarchy that would destroy the reigning government and allow them to take power. In 1970, a United Nations resolution condemned Rhodesia and urged the world to supply moral and material assistance to Rhodesia's enemies operating out of Zambia to the north. Later, the same urging was applied to Mozambique to the east and Angola to the west. When these Marxist-led nations suffered because they had cut themselves off from food, electricity, and jobs that they got from Rhodesia, the United States government sent aid to make up the difference. In 1976, Secretary of State Henry Kissinger actually went to Zambia to promise such aid. Rhodesia could have handled its problems with the revolutionaries, but it could not cope with the betrayals, isolation, sanctions, and pressures it received from so-called friends, England and the United States. For a time, it seemed as though Ian Smith's government could survive as long as South Africa to its south could be relied upon. Ian Smith vowed not to negotiate with the rebels, led by Joshua Nkomo and Robert Mugabe. But in late 1976, Secretary of State Henry Kissinger pressured South African leader John Foster to induce Smith in Rhodesia to negotiate. Eventually he did so, and eventually he capitulated to black rule. And now Rhodesia is Zimbabwe. One man, one vote, one time has triumphed again. Robert Mugabe has ascended to power over the bodies of hundreds, perhaps thousands of innocent victims. The United Nations, England, and the United States, and practically all of the world recognize him as a legitimate leader. He has successfully destroyed all opposition to his rule, white or black, and is a totalitarian dictator. But he is favored by the West as well as by communists. All of what we're talking about here is only some evidence of a world conspiracy that grips most nations, a conspiracy that actually is above communism. It's not led by the Soviet Union. Soviet Union supplies the revolutionary element of the conspiracy. The evolutionary leaders are in the West, chiefly in England and especially in the United States. These twin pressures force good leaders to give up. The resulting new government in nation after nation submits to the socialistic one-world system that is being built. The one-worlders in the United States, Britain, and elsewhere don't care if their efforts lead to communist rule or to socialist rule, as long as the new ruler submits to their designs and becomes part of a new world order. The real issue is never black rule or white rule, or Muslim rule in Algeria versus French-speaking rulers. The real issue is submission to the new world order being arranged by such forces as England's Royal Institute for International Affairs, America's Council on Foreign Relations, and their creation, the United Nations. Looking at this problem another way, the real issue is independence for nations and, of course, freedom for the people versus loss of sovereignty for the nation and bondage to the communist socialist system for the people. Look at South Africa. If all the lies spoken about this nation in the past 10 years were true, which they surely are not, the human rights record for all its people would still exceed that of most of the world. A friend once told me South Africa's supposed denial of human rights is still far less reprehensible than all communist nations, most nations of Asia, and virtually all of the dictatorships in Africa. But much of South Africa's supposed horrors are myths, something that we have already written about in our Birchlog column entitled "The Myths About South Africa." If South Africa is indeed so horrible, which it is not, why do blacks continue to stream into the nation? If the West, and chiefly the United States and the United Nations, were honest crusaders for human rights, why don't they direct their attention to the plight of billions behind the iron and bamboo curtains, thousands of whom are held in prisons, slave labor camps, and detention centers for no other crime than being victims of communist terror? Communist atrocities are real, not myths. Why not direct attention to the vicious caste system in India, or the way women are treated in Muslim nations? Why not make sure that we in the United States are perfect before we tell others to correct their real or imagined sins? Americans ought to be asking why we are so anxious to cut ourselves off from supplies of strategic minerals that we have been getting from South Africa. Chrome, platinum, manganese, vanadium, and other metals that are needed for high-temperature steels, for jet engines, for oil refining equipment, and even a host of everyday use items found in our homes. If we don't get these minerals from South Africa, we are forced either to get them from the Soviet Union or do without, because we don't have them within our own shores. We are indeed committing suicide. We trade with and send aid to the Soviet Union, but we impose sanctions on South Africa. Why? The only answer is because the leaders of the United States are committed to the creation of a one-world system. They are perfectly willing to weaken the United States, even to destroy its independence to satisfy their global designs. For decades, these individuals, typified by Council on Foreign Relations members who have dominated our government for most of the 20th century, have destroyed other governments friendly to the United States and forced communist or socialist one-worlders on nation after nation. Think back. Think back to nationalist China in the late 1940s being betrayed by the United States and Chiang Kai-shek's government having to flee and to turn that nation over to the hands of the bloodiest murderers that the world has ever known, the Red Chinese. Think back to the 1950s when the United States government destroyed Cuba's government under Fulgencio Batista and invited Castro to take power. Castro, whom they knew to be a communist. Go back to the 70s and Ian Smith and what happened to him in Rhodesia as a result of the pressure that came from the United States and elsewhere. Think back to 1979, Anastasio Somoza of Nicaragua betrayed by the United States and forced to abdicate, and the Sandinista communists took that country. Or to 1979 when the Shah of Iran was destroyed by our government and the Ayatollah Khomeini, a vicious and violent anti-American, took power. Think back to just a few years ago when we see Ferdinand Marcos, who wanted to be a friend of the United States, see him exiled and taken from his own country by Americans, and the Philippines continues to move further and further to the left. And now, South Africa. President Reagan, on September 9th of 1985, sent the following official message to the Congress of the United States. I hereby report to the Congress that I have exercised my statutory authority to declare that the policies and actions of the government of South Africa constitute an unusual and extraordinary threat to the foreign policy and economy of the United States, and to declare a national emergency to deal with that threat. That's incredible. That's absolutely incredible. While we have a nation like the Soviet Union invading its neighbors, causing unrest and trouble all over the globe, financing Cuba that finances Nicaragua, and the President of the United States is moving heaven and earth to have us deal with them more, to have more trade with them, to supply them with more aid, to welcome them into the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank and many other things. And while all this is going on, we are deciding that South Africa is a threat to the United States? Well, of course, that led to the Anti-Apartheid Act of 1986, the official name of that sanctions bill, and it called for U.S. funding of anti-apartheid South African groups. It called for the termination of U.S. military cooperation with South Africa. It called for pressure on Western allies to apply similar punitive measures. It called for the unbanning of terrorist organizations such as the African National Congress and the release of what they called political prisoners with the name Nelson Mandela mentioned by name. In his remarks on the Senate floor in opposition to the sanctions bill, Senator Jesse Helms of North Carolina noted that the measure, he said, it's not about segregation, it's not about the sharing of power, it's about the transfer of power to a small minority elite. That elite, said Senator Helms, is the Communist Party of South Africa. He went on to talk about the intent of the new legislation is to recognize the communist movement of South Africa as the legitimate and preferred successor to the present government of that nation. The bill itself, he said, gives preference in almost every respect only to those opponents of the government and those groups that are deeply committed to the Communist Party of South Africa or an organization funded and controlled by the Soviet Union. The non-communist leaders of the blacks and non-whites are treated as though they do not exist. This is what this South Africa Sanctions Bill of 1986 accomplished. The senator from North Carolina then asked, why is it that only persons mentioned by name in the bill are communists? Why is it that the only parties referenced are precisely those parties which are under total control and support of the international communist movement? And yet, even after Senator Helms' testimony before his colleagues in the United States Senate, 84 United States senators voted for the sanctions, and it passed the Senate and it passed the House, which certainly demonstrates the serious problems that exist in our country and that we must be busy about. One response to Senator Helms' remarks came from the Council on Foreign Relations publication called Foreign Affairs. In an article written by Professor Thomas Karras of the City University of New York City in the winter 1986-87 issue of this magazine, we see an article called South African Liberation, the Communist Factor. Professor Karras in the article says very bluntly and very boldly, there is no Soviet influence in the African National Congress. This, of course, is completely false. Are there communists in the African National Congress? A 1982 Senate committee headed by Senator Jeremiah Denton of Alabama published its belief in 1982 that 11 of the 30 leaders of the African National Congress were also members of the South African Communist Party. By 1986, more information had been gained, and a congressman named Dan Burton from Indiana published information that he had assembled, saying that 19 of those 30 top leaders of the African National Congress were communists, were members of the South African Communist Party. In 1986, our own Central Intelligence Agency put together a report, and it had to be pried out of them by Senator Helms, but even they came out with information saying that 18 of the top 30 leaders of the African National Congress were members of the South African Communist Party. In 1986, Oliver Tambo, the head of the African National Congress, a man who himself has never been identified as a member of the South African Communist Party, said, however, quote, the African National Congress and the South African Communist Party have common objectives. How true. On January 23rd, 1987, in response to charges that the organization he leads is controlled by the Soviet Union, Oliver Tambo made the following amazing admission about the weapons that the African National Congress receives from the Kremlin. He said, because we are getting arms from them for free does not mean we are mortgaging ourselves. Does he expect us to believe that Moscow finances what it does not influence? Nevertheless, when African National Congress leader Oliver Tambo came to the United States in January of 1987, he was warmly welcomed by Secretary of State George Shultz. The situation in South Africa, unfortunately, parallels to some degree what is happening in England and in the United States. There are powerful forces in South Africa working in league with the one-worlders and internationalists who are subverting independence wherever it exists and helping communists wherever they operate. America is being betrayed by its own, and the same kind of betrayal may well be unfolding in South Africa. Our Council on Foreign Relations was begun in 1919 at a meeting in Paris at which British participants started their own Royal Institute for International Affairs. The Royal Institute for International Affairs in England, the Council on Foreign Relations in the United States, are twin organizations for the same one world socialist goal. In 1986, in an article I wrote for the New American Magazine, I discussed and commented on the writings of the Council on Foreign Relations founders and on numerous published works of the organization to reach the conclusions that we have stated, that one world socialism is indeed their goal. It is the members of the Council on Foreign Relations in America and the members of the Royal Institute for International Affairs in England that subverted Rhodesia, for example. In South Africa, the huge Anglo-American corporation has been headed by a man named Harry Oppenheimer, who also turns out to be the leader of the South African Institute for International Affairs, a subsidiary of the Royal Institute started in England. There has also been formed the Australian Institute for International Affairs. And during my visit to Australia in May of 1985, I visited the headquarters of the Australian Institute for International Affairs in Melbourne. Confirmation of intense cooperation between the Australian Institute, between the Council on Foreign Relations, and then again the Royal Institute in England was freely given by the personnel that I met at the headquarters of this organization in Melbourne. One woman I remember meeting told me with great delight that in 1983 the organization, the Australian Institute for International Affairs, had celebrated its 50th anniversary, and they had a gala affair, and the chief spokesman at their affair was a guest from South Africa, Mr. Harry Oppenheimer, the head of the South African Institute for International Affairs. In late 1985, officials of the Anglo-American Corporation, led by Chairman Gavin Relly, journeyed to visit African National Congress leaders in Zambia. Additional contacts have also been made since. The African National Congress is banned in South Africa. Hence, it has set up headquarters in Zambia. And for these prominent industrialists in South Africa to go to Zambia to sit down with the leaders of the African National Congress smacks of the same kind of betrayal that we Americans see more and more when people like David Rockefeller and corporate heads in America journey to Moscow to sit down and discuss things with the leaders of the criminal Soviet Union. All of this smacks of betrayal, somewhat, as I say, like our corporate leaders trading with and supplying the Soviets. And like the U.S., much of the mass media in South Africa is controlled by individuals tied to these one-world groups. The South African government has recently signed a non-aggression pact with the communist government in Mozambique. Early in 1988, the same Gavin Relly, the chairman of the Anglo-American Corporation, showed up in Maputo, the capital of Mozambique, to meet with the communist leaders of that nation. There are even some in South Africa who express the belief that their government should negotiate directly with the Soviets, that the U.S. may in fact be a greater threat to South Africa than are the Soviets. Our Council on Foreign Relations leaders must be delighted. In a recent article appearing in the World Today magazine, the journal of the London-based Royal Institute for International Affairs suggested South Africa-USSR cooperation. Yes, indeed, there is a conspiracy. But because there is hope. What we face in America and what others face throughout the world is not so much evolutionary force that can't be stopped, but deliberately caused deeds that can be reversed. If indeed it's a conspiracy, it can be stopped. If it's natural forces just flowing to a consequence, how do you stop them? And so indeed, because there is a conspiracy, there is hope. If we in America can force our own leaders to cease helping communists and to stop hurting friendly nations like South Africa, the world will quickly be a better place. Communist governments will be forced to exist without outside help, and they will quickly collapse. Friendly nations like South Africa will cease seeing their own citizens emulating the pattern of betrayal that grips the West. And loyal South Africans can work out whatever problems exist in their own nation. And this is what we must do in America. We must wake the town and tell the people about what our government is doing in South Africa, about what our government is doing to help the communists in the Soviet Union and elsewhere, about what our own government is doing to destroy the economic life of our country. We can do it. We must do it. We have friends all throughout the world who want desperately for us to succeed. So let's be about our business. Thank you very much.